The chrome of the hearse was cold against Renata Holloway's cheekbone. She could see her son's casket reflected in the metal, a distorted mahogany blur just 10 feet away, surrounded by white lilies that bent under the weight of Memphis rain. The casket was closed. She would never see Isaiah's face again. And now a stranger's knee was pressing into the small of her back, grinding her hip bone against the wet gravel.
"Stop resisting!" Deputy Curtis Delancy shouted, yanking her wrists together behind her.
Renata wasn't resisting. She had stopped fighting the moment the cold steel touched her skin. She had simply gone still, the way prey goes still when the predator's jaws close. The handcuffs clicked. The sound was louder than the rain. Before we go any further, wherever you're watching from right now, whatever time it is on your clock, pause for just a moment, because this story is about to take a turn that will stay with you long after it ends. Subscribe and turn on that notification bell, because tomorrow's story is the one you cannot afford to miss. Renata's hat, the wide-brimmed black hat she had chosen so carefully that morning, the one that shadowed her face from cameras she hadn't invited, was trampled into the mud 3 feet away. Rain soaked through her silk dress, plastering the fabric against her spine. She could feel gravel embedded in her palms, where she had tried to catch herself when he first shoved her. "I told you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am the mother of the deceased."
"Yeah, and I'm the king of Tennessee," Curtis laughed, a sharp barking sound that seemed to echo off the gravestones. "You people always got a story."
"You people." The words landed like a slap. Renata closed her eyes. She could hear her brother Warren screaming somewhere behind her. She could hear her sister-in-law Denise wailing. She could hear the funeral director pleading with someone, another deputy maybe, one who had materialized from a second patrol car. "Ma'am, you need to cooperate," Curtis said, hauling her upright by the chain between her cuffs. Pain shot through her shoulders. "We got a call about vehicle break-ins in this lot. You match the description." Renata opened her eyes. She looked directly at him for the first time. Curtis Delancy was maybe 40 years old, with a sunburned face and pale blue eyes that held no curiosity, no doubt, no recognition. He saw nothing when he looked at her, nothing except her skin. "What description?" Renata asked quietly. Curtis's lip curled. "Black female, suspicious behavior, lurking near vehicles." "I was standing beside my son's hearse."
"Sure you were."
He spun her around and marched her toward his patrol car. The path took them directly past Isaiah's casket. The mourners had scattered, held back by the second deputy, who had his hand resting on his taser. Renata's eyes locked onto the mahogany wood, the brass handles, the spray of white roses her niece had arranged that morning, because Isaiah always said white roses reminded him of hope. The casket was still above ground. The grave was open, a dark rectangle of Tennessee clay waiting to receive him. The burial could not continue without her. "Mama!" Warren's voice cracked across the cemetery. "Renata! Don't say anything. I'm calling everyone. Everyone!" Curtis glanced back at the commotion and smirked. He opened the rear door of his cruiser and placed his palm on Renata's head, shoving her down and into the back seat. The plastic bench smelled of vomit and disinfectant. The door slammed. Through the rain-streaked window, Renata watched her son's casket grow smaller. She watched her family held at bay like criminals. She watched the second deputy laugh at something Curtis said through the radio. Her hands throbbed behind her back. Her cheekbone pulsed where it had struck the hearse. A bruise was already forming on her hip. But the tears on her face had stopped. Something else had taken their place. Something cold and patient and infinitely more dangerous than grief. Deputy Curtis Delancy had just arrested Justice Renata Holloway of the Supreme Court of the United States. And he had absolutely no idea. 27 years ago, Renata Holloway had screamed for 14 hours before Isaiah finally arrived. The doctor said it was one of the longest natural labors they had seen. Franklin, her husband, had held her hand through every contraction, whispering that she was the strongest woman in any room she entered. When Isaiah finally came, small and slick and furious at the world, Renata had laughed through her tears.
"He's already fighting," Franklin had said, cradling his son. "Just like his mama."
Isaiah never stopped fighting. He fought through a childhood in the roughest part of Memphis, through a scholarship to Morehouse, through law school at Howard. He became a public defender because he said the people who needed lawyers most were the ones who could afford them least. 3 weeks ago, Isaiah had collapsed during a charity basketball game at his old high school. Undiagnosed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. His heart had simply stopped. He was 27 years old. Renata had been on the bench when she got the call. She remembered the clerk's face, pale, hesitant, terrified to interrupt a sitting justice. She remembered the walk to her chambers, the phone pressed to her ear, her brother Warren's voice breaking as he said the words that ended her world. "Isaiah's gone, Renata. Our boy is gone." She had not screamed. She had not collapsed. She had simply ended the call, removed her robe, and walked out of the Supreme Court building into the winter air of Washington, D.C. She hadn't spoken to a reporter since. She hadn't issued a statement. She had asked, begged for privacy. No motorcade, no federal marshals, no announcement to local authorities. She just wanted to bury her son beside his father in the Memphis cemetery where 5 generations of Holloways rested. Franklin had died 2 years earlier, pancreatic cancer. The federal courthouse downtown bore his name now, the Franklin D. Holloway Justice Center. He had spent 30 years as a civil rights attorney before becoming a judge, and the city had honored him with bronze and marble. But Renata didn't want bronze and marble. She wanted silence. She wanted to kneel in the red Tennessee clay and tell her son she was sorry she hadn't been there when his heart stopped. The funeral at Riverside Memorial Gardens was supposed to be small, 40 people, maybe 50. Family, a few of Isaiah's colleagues from the public defender's office, some childhood friends who still lived in the neighborhood. No cameras, no press, no strangers. But Deputy Curtis Delancy was a stranger who didn't wait for invitations. He had been patrolling the wealthy side of the cemetery, the side with the premium plots, the granite mausoleums, the manicured hedges, when he noticed the gathering near the Holloway family section. The cars were too modest, he later told his supervisor. The people didn't match the neighborhood. He didn't check the burial registry. He didn't call the funeral home. He didn't ask a single question before he decided that these mourners were a problem he needed to solve. When Renata saw the patrol car pull up, its tires crushing the gravel path that was meant only for hearses, she felt a cold premonition settle into her chest. But she never imagined, not even for a moment, that the uniform approaching her would dare to touch a woman kneeling beside her own child's casket. She was wrong. Deputy Curtis Delancy walked like a man who had never been questioned in his life. He strode past the rows of headstones with his hand resting on his belt, his eyes scanning the mourners with undisguised contempt. When the funeral director, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Pemberton, moved to intercept him, Curtis held up one palm without breaking stride. "Step aside, sir. Official business." "Officer, we're in the middle of a service." "I said step aside." Mr. Pemberton stepped aside. Renata watched from her seat beside the casket, her black-gloved hands folded in her lap. She saw Curtis's eyes move across the crowd, cataloging faces, dismissing each one. When his gaze landed on her, it stopped. He walked directly to her. "Ma'am?" His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "You the owner of that silver Nissan with the rental plates, parked over by the east gate?" Renata looked up at him. The rain had softened to a drizzle, but drops still fell from the brim of her hat. "I am." "Need you to step away from the proceedings. Got a report of vehicle break-ins in the slot. Your car matches the description of one seen fleeing the scene." Renata's brother Warren rose from a seat 3 rows back. "Excuse me, she's been right here the entire—" "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay seated." "That's my sister. She's the mother of—" "I don't care if she's the Queen of England." Curtis's voice hardened. "I said sit down." Warren didn't sit. His wife Denise grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. The kind of fear that comes from a lifetime of knowing what uniforms can do when they decide you don't belong. Renata stood slowly. She was tall, 5'10" in her low heels, and she used every inch of that height now.
Deputy, my name is Renata Holloway. This is my son Isaiah's funeral. If you check with Mr. Pemberton, he can confirm our reservation for this plot. My vehicle has been parked and unoccupied since 9 this morning.
Curtis looked her up and down. His lip curled slightly, a micro-expression of disgust that he probably didn't even know he was making.
Holloway, he repeated, as if testing the name for lies. Got any ID?
Of course. Renata reached slowly toward her purse, the small black clutch resting on her chair. Slow! Curtis's hand flew to his holster. The snap of the leather strap coming undone was audible in the sudden silence. Renata froze. Her fingers hovered 6 inches from the purse. "I'm retrieving my identification," she said carefully, "exactly as you requested." "Yeah, well, I've heard that before." Curtis stepped closer, crowding her space. "Tell you what, how about you just come with me to the car and we'll sort this out at the station?" "Deputy, I am not leaving my son's funeral." That wasn't a request. What happened next took fewer than 5 seconds. Curtis grabbed Renata's wrist. She instinctively pulled back, not fighting, just reacting to the shock of unwanted contact. Curtis used her reflexive motion as justification to spin her around, forcing her arm up behind her back at an angle that made her gasp. "Resisting an officer," he shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm not resist." He slammed her forward. Her face hit the side of the hearse, the cold metal splitting the skin over her cheekbone. She tasted copper. Behind her, screaming erupted. Warren's voice, Denise's sobs, Mr. Pemberton's frantic pleas. Curtis cuffed her with practice efficiency. Then he began to drag her across the grass, past the rows of white chairs, past her son's open grave. As they passed the casket, Curtis leaned close to her ear. His breath was hot against her neck, smelling of coffee and tobacco. "You people need to learn," he whispered, "that this side of the cemetery ain't for you." Renata went completely still, not from fear, from something far more dangerous. From the absolute certainty of what she was going to do to him. The Shelby County Sheriff's substation smelled of burnt coffee and institutional neglect. Curtis Delancy marched Renata through the back entrance, one hand gripping her elbow hard enough to leave fingerprints. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow pallor. Deputies looked up from their desks as they passed. Some smirked. One actually applauded. "Delancey's got another one," someone called out. Laughter rippled through the bullpen. Renata said nothing. She walked with her head high, her torn silk dress still damp against her skin. Her bare left foot, she had lost the heel in the cemetery grass, leaving faint prints on the linoleum. Curtis shoved her toward the intake desk, where a heavy-set sergeant with a mustard stain on his uniform looked up from a crossword puzzle. "What have we got?" "Suspicious vehicle, resisting arrest, possible connection to the break-in ring." Curtis was already embellishing, already building his story. "Found her lurking at the cemetery on the premium side. No ID, gave me attitude, tried to run." "I did not try to run," Renata said quietly. "She talks back too." Curtis grinned. "Booker, I'm gonna write this up nice and detailed." The booking process was designed to strip dignity. Renata understood this. She had written opinions about it. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it physically were 2 different educations. They took her fingerprints, pressing each finger onto the glass scanner with unnecessary force. They took her photograph. Curtis made her hold the placard while he adjusted the camera angle, telling her to stop looking uppity. They took her jewelry, the simple gold wedding band Franklin had placed on her finger 31 years ago, the pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. Curtis dangled the wedding ring in front of his face, inspecting it. "Nice rock. Where'd you steal this from?" "It was my husband's ring to me." Sure it was. He dropped it into an evidence bag with a carelessness that made Renata's chest tighten. They put her in holding cell 3. The space was 8 feet by 6 feet, with a steel bench bolted to the wall, and a toilet with no seat. The walls were covered in scratched profanity. The smell was bleach layered over something worse. The door clanged shut. Renata stood in the center of the cell. She did not sit. She did not pace. She simply breathed, counting each inhale, each exhale.
And then she began to build her case. Time of arrest, approximately 2:47 p.m. Badge number, she had seen it on Curtis's chest, 7SE041. Injuries sustained, laceration above right cheekbone, contusions on both wrists, possible sprained left shoulder, abrasion on right hip. Witnesses, Warren, Denise, Mr. Pemberton, approximately 40 funeral attendees. Constitutional violations. Fourth Amendment, unreasonable seizure without probable cause. Fifth Amendment, denial of due process. 14th Amendment, equal protection. Possibly 8th Amendment, depending on how the night progressed. She had spent 30 years mastering the architecture of law. Every statute, every precedent, every procedural requirement existed in her mind like rooms in a vast mansion she had built brick by brick. Curtis Delancy had just walked into that mansion and set it on fire. He thought he was the one with power. He thought the badge made him untouchable. He was about to learn that some buildings don't burn, they explode. Outside the cell, Renata could hear Curtis laughing with the other deputies. He was telling the story already, embellishing her resistance, mimicking her voice when she said she was the mother of the deceased. "And get this," Curtis said, loud enough for her to hear. "She told me she was a Supreme Court justice." The laughter that followed was long and loud. Renata closed her eyes. Let them laugh. Curtis Delancy was 3 paragraphs into his arrest report when the first phone rang. He ignored it. Sergeant Briggs at the front desk could handle whatever it was. Curtis was focused on crafting his narrative, the suspicious vehicle, the evasive behavior, the way the suspect had lunged toward her purse in a threatening manner. He was going to add assaulting an officer. His wrist did feel a little sore. That was close enough.
The second phone rang, then the third, then Sergeant Briggs's personal cell, which never rang during shift.
Curtis looked up. Briggs was standing now, his face the color of old milk. He was saying, "Yes, sir," over and over, his voice climbing higher with each repetition. The door to Sheriff Boyd Tanner's office flew open. Tanner was a big man, 62 years old with a silver crew cut and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years pretending problems didn't exist. He was holding his phone away from his ear like it had bitten him. "Delancy," Tanner's voice cracked across the bullpen. "My office, now." Curtis stood, straightening his uniform. "Sheriff, I was just finishing the report on—" "Now!" The walk to Tanner's office felt longer than it should have. Curtis noticed that the other deputies had gone quiet. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at their desks, their screens, anywhere else. Inside the office, Tanner slammed the door so hard the blinds rattled. "Do you know who just called me?" Tanner's voice was a whisper, which was somehow worse than shouting. "The governor. Governor Ashton himself. And do you know who was on the line with him? The Attorney General of the United States." Curtis blinked. "I don't—" "They want to know why we have a Supreme Court justice in our holding cell." The words didn't make sense. Curtis heard them, processed them, but they refused to assemble into meaning. That's impossible. She was just some woman at a funeral. She didn't even have ID. Her brother called the governor's office. The governor called Washington. Washington confirmed. Tanner's hands were shaking. Her name is Renata Holloway. Her husband was Franklin Holloway, the Franklin Holloway, the one with his name on the federal courthouse downtown. She sits on the highest court in this country, Delancy, and you dragged her through a cemetery and threw her in a cell. Curtis felt the blood drain from his face. His legs went weak. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. "I didn't know," he whispered. "How was I supposed to know? She didn't look like—" "Like what?" Tanner cut him off, his eyes blazing. "Like a justice? What exactly does a justice look like, Delancy?" Curtis opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Sometimes the truth surfaces exactly when it needs to. Stories like this, they remind us why staying aware matters, why assumptions can cost everything. The front doors of the station burst open. 4 men in dark suits strode in, their credentials already out. FBI. Behind them, more suits. Department of Justice. "Sheriff Tanner," the lead agent announced.
We're here to secure the scene and escort Justice Holloway. We'll also need to preserve all documentation, video footage, and communication records from the past 6 hours.
Tanner nodded weakly. He looked at Curtis the way a man looks at a sinking ship.
Give them your badge, Tanner said quietly, and your weapon. You're suspended pending investigation. Curtis's hands trembled as he unclipped his holster. The badge came off his chest with a soft ripping sound, leaving a darker patch on the fabric where the sun hadn't faded it. 30 minutes ago, he had been laughing. Now his career was ending. And somewhere in holding cell 3, the woman he had called "you people" was about to walk free and take everything he had ever built with her. The story broke nationally within hours. Supreme Court Justice arrested at son's funeral. The headline crawled across every news ticker from Memphis to Manhattan. Camera crews descended on the Shelby County substation like locusts. The sheriff's department issued a terse statement calling it an isolated incident and a regrettable misunderstanding. But Renata Holloway knew it was neither isolated nor a misunderstanding, and she was about to prove it. 3 days after her arrest, while she was still in Memphis preparing for Isaiah's delayed burial, her phone rang. The caller identified himself as Pastor Clarence Webb, retired, 81 years old, calling from a nursing home in Germantown.
Justice Holloway. His voice was thin but steady. I saw you on the news, and I need to tell you something. That deputy, Delancy, he did the same thing to my family 4 years ago at my wife Loretta's funeral.
Renata sat down slowly. Tell me everything. Pastor Webb's story was devastating in its familiarity. He and Loretta had been married for 53 years. When she passed from complications of diabetes, Clarence had arranged for her burial in the Riverside Memorial Gardens, the same cemetery, the same premium section that the Webb family had purchased plots in decades earlier. Deputy Curtis Delancy had arrived halfway through the service. He claimed there had been reports of unauthorized gatherings. He demanded identification from the elderly pastor. When Clarence moved too slowly, his arthritis made everything slow, Curtis had shoved him. Loretta's casket sat 10 feet away, draped in white roses.
He made my grandchildren watch, Clarence said, his voice breaking. He made them watch him push their grandfather onto the ground beside their grandmother's grave. The youngest one, she was only 7. She still has nightmares.
What happened after? Renata asked.
The county offered us money, $50,000. We had to sign papers saying we wouldn't talk about it. My daughter said we should take it, said fighting would just bring more pain. Clarence paused. I've regretted that signature every day since.
Renata's legal team, led by a Memphis civil rights attorney named Solange Dupree, began digging. What they found was a pattern buried under layers of confidential settlements and non-disclosure agreements. The Webb family wasn't alone. There was the Okonkwo family, a Nigerian-American surgeon and his wife, ejected from their son's memorial service 18 months ago. Settlement, $75,000. There was the Pittman family, a retired postal worker and his sisters, removed from their mother's graveside 2 years before that. Settlement, $60,000. And there was the Carter family, whose story was the most enraging of all. Their teenage son had been celebrating his acceptance to Fisk University with a visit to his grandmother's grave. Curtis Delancy had detained him for loitering and held him for 6 hours. The boy had missed his own acceptance dinner. Settlement, $40,000. 4 families, 4 incidents, all black, all in the premium section of Riverside Memorial Gardens, all involving Deputy Curtis Delancy. Total settlement money paid by Shelby County to silence victims, $225,000. When Solange laid the evidence on the conference table, Renata stared at the stack of files. Each one represented a goodbye that had been stolen, a sacred moment that had been defiled. The county knew, Renata said quietly. They paid these families to disappear. They enabled him to do it again. They'll argue the settlements prove nothing, Solange warned. The NDAs prevent the families from testifying.
Not anymore. Renata picked up her phone. I'm calling Pastor Webb back, and then I'm calling every family on this list. Those NDAs were signed under duress, after civil rights violations. No court in this country will enforce them.
She dialed. Should those families have taken the money and stayed silent?
Were they protecting themselves, or were they enabling the next victim? There's no easy answer. Survival isn't simple.
But now, finally, their silence was ending.
And Curtis Delancey was about to face every voice he had tried to bury. Curtis Delancey hired the most expensive defense attorney in Memphis.
Gerald Ashworth was a silver-haired bulldog who had spent 30 years defending cops, politicians, and corporations. He charged $800 an hour and had never lost a civil rights case. His strategy was always the same: attack the victim.
The defense filed its answer to Renata's lawsuit 6 weeks after the arrest. The document was 43 pages of legal fiction. According to Ashworth's narrative, Renata Holloway had been hostile and uncooperative from the moment Deputy Delancy approached. She had made threatening gestures toward her purse. She had verbally abused the deputy and physically resisted lawful detention. The filing concluded with a claim that would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. Deputy Delancy had acted reasonably and in good faith based on the information available to him.
Solange Dupree read the filing aloud in her conference room. Renata sat across from her, perfectly still.
"They're going to put you on trial," Solange said. "They'll say you were aggressive. They'll say you should have just complied. They'll find some expert to testify that Curtis followed procedure."
"Let them," Renata replied. Solange smiled. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, because they don't know about the cameras." Riverside Memorial Gardens, it turned out, had installed security cameras 2 years earlier after a string of vandalism incidents. The cameras covered every corner of the property, including the premium section where Isaiah was buried. Curtis Delancey had never thought to ask, neither had his department. They had assumed that whatever happened at the cemetery was a matter of his word against Renata's. They were wrong. The footage was crystal clear. It showed Renata seated beside the casket, head bowed, hands folded. It showed Curtis's patrol car crushing the gravel path. It showed him ignoring Mr. Pemberton, stalking toward Renata, invading her space. And it showed, in devastating detail, the moment Curtis grabbed her wrist, while her hand was still 6 inches from her purse, and slammed her face first into the hearse. There was no threatening gesture. There was no resistance. There was only a grieving mother being brutalized beside her dead son. When Ashworth saw the footage during discovery, his face went gray. He requested an emergency meeting with his client. "They want to settle," Solange told Renata 3 days later. $7 million. They'll admit no wrongdoing, but they'll pay. Renata didn't hesitate. "No." "Renata, $7 million is—" "$7 million is the price of silence." Renata stood, walking to the window of Solange's office. She could see the Franklin D. Holloway Justice Center from here, her husband's name carved in granite above the entrance. "I didn't come here to be silent. I came here to bury my son, and that man stole the last moment I would ever have with Isaiah." She turned back to Solange, her eyes burning. "I want a trial. I want a jury. I want the whole world to see what he did and what that department let him do for years." Solange nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll give him." The trial of Holloway v. Shelby County began on a Monday in October. The federal courthouse, the one that bore Franklin Holloway's name, was surrounded by news vans and protesters. Some held signs supporting Renata. Others, a smaller but louder group, waved back the blue flags and shouted about respecting law enforcement. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters lined the walls. The air was thick with tension and the hum of barely contained outrage. Curtis Delancey sat at the defense table, flanked by Gerald Ashworth and 2 junior associates. He had lost weight since the arrest. His suit hung loose on his frame. His eyes, once arrogant, now darted nervously around the room. Renata sat at the plaintiff's table with Solange. She wore a charcoal gray suit, professional, understated. She didn't need to perform power. She simply was power. The first 3 days were devoted to Renata's case. The cemetery footage played on large screens mounted throughout the courtroom. Jurors watched Curtis drag Renata across the grass. One juror, a middle-aged woman in the front row, covered her mouth with her hand. Mr. Pemberton testified about Curtis's refusal to check the burial registry. Warren testified about watching his sister's face hit the hearse.
Denise described the sound, a wet, hollow thud that still woke her at night. Then came the other families. Pastor Clarence Webb was wheeled to the witness stand. At 81, his body was frail, but his voice was steady. "My wife and I were married 53 years, he said. She was the love of my life. And that man, he pointed a trembling finger at Curtis, made her funeral the worst day of my life, instead of just the saddest." The Okonkwo family testified. The Pittmans, the Carters. One by one, they told their stories. One by one, the pattern became undeniable. But the most devastating evidence came from the county's own servers. Solange's team had subpoenaed internal emails. What they found was damning. In a chain from 18 months earlier, a dispatcher had written to Curtis, "Heads up, another group in the premium section. Doesn't look right." Curtis had replied, "On it. Time to clear out the wrong funerals." His supervisor, Lieutenant Vance Burdett, had responded, "Make it quick. Less paperwork if they leave on their own." The emails flashed across the courtroom screens. The gallery erupted. Judge Thornton banged her gavel, but the damage was done. If you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong somewhere you had every right to be, a restaurant, a store, a neighborhood, a cemetery, tell us your story in the comments. You're not alone. Curtis stared at the screen, at his own words magnified for the world to see. His attorney whispered something urgent in his ear, but Curtis wasn't listening. He was watching his life end, one email at a time. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Renata waited in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Warren sat beside her, holding her hand. Denise paced by the window. Solange reviewed notes she didn't need to review, just to keep her hands busy. When the bailiff knocked, Renata's heart stuttered, not from fear, from anticipation. The courtroom was silent as the jurors filed back to their seats. Curtis stood at the defense table, gripping the edge like a drowning man clutching driftwood. His attorney had stopped whispering reassurances hours ago. Judge Thornton looked at the jury foreman, a retired teacher named Constance Pike, 64 years old, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff carried the verdict form to the judge. She read it silently, her expression unchanged. Then she handed it back. "Please read the verdict." Constance Pike stood. Her hands were steady. In the matter of Holloway versus Shelby County, on the question of liability for Deputy Curtis Delancy, we find the defendant liable for violation of the plaintiff's civil rights. A murmur swept through the gallery. On the question of liability for Shelby County, we find the defendant liable for deliberate indifference to a pattern of civil rights violations. The murmur grew louder. For compensatory damages, we award the plaintiff $5 million. Curtis's attorney exhaled. $5 million was survivable. The county's insurance would cover most of it. For punitive damages, Constance Pike paused. She looked directly at Curtis Delancy. We award the plaintiff $10 million. The courtroom exploded. Shouts, gasps, a sob from somewhere in the back. Judge Thornton hammered her gavel, but even she seemed unsurprised by the reaction. $15 million. Renata closed her eyes. She felt Warren's grip tighten on her hand. She heard Solange whisper, "We did it." But the verdict wasn't the end. As the gallery settled and Curtis slumped into his chair, the courtroom doors opened. 2 federal marshals walked in, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Curtis Delancy," one of them announced, "you are under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law, in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242. The courtroom went silent again. A different silence this time. Stunned. Electric. Curtis looked up, his face bloodless. "What? No. The trial is over. You can't." "The civil trial is over." The marshal pulled handcuffs from his belt. "The criminal case is just beginning." They cuffed him at the defense table. The same wrists that had cuffed Renata. The same steel. The same click. As they led him toward the side door, Curtis turned. His eyes found Renata's across the courtroom. She held his gaze. She didn't smile, She didn't gloat. She simply watched as the man who had called her "you people" was led away in chains. The money was justice. But what happened 6 months later was healing. 6 months later, the federal criminal trial ended. Curtis Delancey stood before Judge Marion Cross in a Memphis federal courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of a uniform. The swagger was gone. The sunburned arrogance had faded to a pallid gray. He looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of consequence had compressed him. Judge Cross reviewed the sentencing guidelines, her voice crisp and merciless.
Mr. Delancey, you were entrusted with authority. You swore an oath to protect and serve. Instead, you used your badge as a weapon against the vulnerable. You didn't just violate Justice Holloway's rights. You made a career of violating rights, secure in the knowledge that your department would protect you.
Curtis wept. Snot dripped from his nose. He had prepared a statement about being sorry, about making mistakes, about deserving a second chance. Judge Cross wasn't interested. 12 years federal custody, she pronounced. No possibility of early parole. The gavel fell. Curtis collapsed into his chair. The marshals lifted him by the elbows and led him away. Renata watched from the gallery. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a hollow kind of completion, like closing a book she had never wanted to read. The enablers faced consequences too. Lieutenant Vance Burdett was indicted for obstruction. Sheriff Boyd Tanner resigned in disgrace, his pension revoked. The department underwent a complete restructuring under federal oversight. But Renata wasn't finished. The $15 million sat in an account she refused to touch for personal use. Every dollar was stained with the memory of the hearse's cold chrome against her cheek. She couldn't spend it on herself. She couldn't even look at the balance. So she built something instead. The Isaiah Holloway Justice Initiative launched 3 months after the verdict. Its mission was simple: provide free legal representation to victims of civil rights violations who couldn't afford to fight back. The initiative partnered with law schools across the South, training the next generation of attorneys in the tradition Isaiah had believed in, that everyone deserved someone in their corner. Pastor Clarence Webb was the first person Renata called when the initiative opened its doors. "Justice Holloway," his thin voice crackled through the phone, "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll be on our advisory board," Renata replied. "Say you'll help us find the families who signed those silence agreements. Say we'll make sure no one else has to choose between survival and justice." Clarence said yes. The Riverside Memorial Gardens underwent changes too. The cemetery's board of directors, terrified of further liability, agreed to a complete overhaul of policies. Security personnel would be trained in de-escalation. Any law enforcement entering the grounds during a service would require written authorization from the funeral director. And the premium section, where 5 generations of Holloways rested, was renamed. A small bronze plaque now stood at the entrance, the Franklin and Isaiah Holloway Memorial Grove. On a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after Curtis Delancey had dragged her across the grass, Renata returned. She came alone this time. No Warren, no Denise, no attorneys or marshals or cameras. Just a woman in a simple black dress, carrying white roses. The cemetery was quiet. Bird song drifted through the Spanish moss. The Tennessee sun warmed her face as she walked the familiar path. She reached Isaiah's headstone first. The granite was polished, elegant. Isaiah Warren Holloway, beloved son, defender of the voiceless. 1996-2023. Renata knelt on the grass. She placed the roses against the stone. "Hi, baby," she whispered. The wind stirred the leaves overhead. "I finally get to say goodbye properly. No sirens, no strangers, just us." She told him about the initiative, about the families they had already helped, about the law students who quoted his old cases in their briefs, about how his name meant something now, not because of what had happened to her, but because of how he had lived. "You wanted to heal people," she said, her voice thick. "You didn't get to do it with medicine, but you're doing it now, through me, through everyone we help."
She reached into her pocket and pulled out a faded courthouse ID badge. Franklin D. Holloway. The photo showed him young, serious, determined, the man who had taught her that law was love made visible. She placed the badge against the granite, next to the roses.
"Our boy is with you now," she whispered. "Take care of each other until I get there." She stayed until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. Then she stood, brushed the grass from her knees, and turned to leave.
At the cemetery entrance, a young groundskeeper was raking leaves. He was maybe 20 years old, wearing a Riverside Memorial uniform. When he saw Renata, he stopped.
"Ma'am," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say, my little brother is applying to law school next year, because of your son's story, because of what you did."
Renata looked at him. For the first time in a year, she smiled. "Tell him to fight for the ones who can't fight for themselves," she said. "That's what Isaiah would have wanted."
She walked to her car. The engine hummed to life. The road stretched ahead, winding through the Tennessee hills, toward a future she hadn't expected to build. The grief would never leave. It lived in her bones now, a permanent resident. But beside it, something else had taken root. Purpose, legacy, the stubborn, defiant belief that pain could be transformed into protection.
Justice Renata Holloway drove toward the sunset. She had work to do. Have you ever had to fight just to be allowed to grieve in peace?
If you haven't already, subscribe now and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next videos. Thank you for watching, and remember to be careful who you judge.